This is lecture 3.1 on post-war conditions in the United States after the Second World War. What we want to begin with is just a kind of a brief overview that's going to carry us through this third epoch. What's going to be the lead feature of Epoch 3, which is really from the Second World War to present day, is the dominance in U.S. history of foreign policy. And it's not our intention here to generate this course into a course on American foreign policy, but it's not possible to discuss U.S. history from 1945 onwards without a lengthy discussion of American foreign policy. We'll start off by just taking a brief look once again at the conferences that wrapped up the Second World War, most notably Yalta and Potsdam. In Yalta, they decided, the Soviets and the United States decided that Europe would be divided between them. Now, this rather ushers in the era of the Cold War. It became very apparent, as I said in previous lectures, it became very apparent really by 1943 and certainly by 1944 that after the war was over, that Germany would be defeated, Japan would be defeated, and after the war, the two dominant players would be the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union being state socialist, the United States being free market, laissez-faire with a heavy element of Keynesianism, and so it became apparent that there was a conflict of interest between the Soviets and the United States. Actually, way before then, as the instance of the Bolshevik Revolution, as we discussed shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, the United States actually had a volunteer expeditionary force in the Soviet Union trying to reinstall the Tsarist administration. So, at any rate, these two forces are going to be opposed to each other, so the Cold War kind of develops very rapidly at the end of the Second World War. In 1947, this is going to be kind of the pivotal thing. From 1947 until 1991, the Soviet Union will cease to exist on the 25th of December, 1991. And so from 1947 until 1991, the obsession, or the primary objective in U.S. foreign policy is the containment of the Soviet Union. This will first be enunciated in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. Okay? Truman will also in 1947, pursuant to this doctrine, establish the National Security Council. In April of 1950, in perhaps, at least during this era, their most pivotal paper or report, the National Security Council will publish paper number 68, NSC 68, which calls for the use of military force if necessary to contain the Soviet Union pursuant to the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union is already established, and that's kind of what we're going to go over in this early. Now, the first move by the United States is going to be to establish what they hope will be a cordon sanitaire around the Soviet Union. In other words, they're going to try to create a fence. Now, what we see here is the first of them is in 1949, the formation of NATO. NATO exists to this day, which really, when you think about it, it just kind of tangentially doesn't make a lot of sense, because the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was specifically designed to prevent Soviet aggression against Western Europe. So when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, one would think that NATO would cease to exist as well. But we'll see in the 1990s that in a brilliant move, in an absolutely brilliant move to keep the United States from being marginalized, the United States will be pivotal in redefining the role of NATO. Okay, now in the Middle East, you'll have the Central Treaty Organization. We'll go over these in detail. This map is just to familiarize you. This will be the inheritor of what originally is the Baghdad Pact, which is led by Great Britain and includes Iraq as their pivotal player. We'll have the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which of course will be the impetus for U.S. involvement in Indochina and the Vietnam conflict. We'll have Japan, the Japanese-U.S. bilateral alliance, and the Republic, which is South Korea, the Republic of Korea and the United States and their bilateral alliance. We'll also have ANZUS, which is Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. And we'll go over these in greater detail. And you see, as I said, 1949 defense of Western Europe. In response to the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union will form the Warsaw Pact. And as evidence that it was a response to NATO rather than an aggressive move on the part of the Soviets, as part of the Warsaw Pact's charter, it stipulated that if NATO ever disbands, the Warsaw Pact will disband as well. Now, they may have put that in there because they really knew that NATO would not be disbanding given the American position vis-a-vis the Soviets, which is to say face-to-face to the Soviets in terms of the Soviets. Okay. As I mentioned, in the Middle East, the original formation is going to be the Baghdad Pact. And the Baghdad Pact will include Iraq, Turkey, Iran as the pivotal players. And without getting into a lengthy discussion of the background, after the First World War, Great Britain received mandatory control from the League of Nations of Transjordan, Iraq, Palestine, and Egypt. Okay? British control over Iraq will collapse in 1958 with the Free Officers' Revolution. Okay, there will be a coup d'etat against Nouri al-Said, who is at the time anyways, the British Prime Minister. And actually, Nouri al-Said will meet a very fateful end. The crowd, actually, the Iraqis will catch him in Baghdad, disguised as a woman trying to get out of the country, and they hang him. Okay, so prior to 1958, Iraq will be a pivotal member of the Baghdad Pact. Well, after the 1958 revolution, Iraq will leave the Baghdad Pact. The British role in the Middle East at this point becomes secondary to the United States because they've also lost Palestine with the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Okay, so the United States will take the lead in this. And the United States, one of the things we're going to clarify a few times in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is the United States does not become aligned with Israel until the early 1970s, until after the enunciation of the Nixon Doctrine. At this point in time, actually, they don't recognize the State of Israel as such. They're very iffy about dealings with Israel. Okay, so after 58, the containment alliance system in the Middle East will be taken over by the Central Treaty Organization, which in point of fact never really works very well. Its pivotal player will be Iran until 1979 in the Islamic Revolution. It will include Turkey, but ultimately it will be replaced, and we'll talk about this when we get into the 70s and 80s as it develops, with what essentially is a pillar system, where the United States interests in the Middle East are going to be supported by a U.S. alliance with pillars, okay, one of which will be Turkey, one of which will be Iran, one of which will be Saudi Arabia, one of which will be Israel. And again, it doesn't actually ever work very well, and it fails utterly when the Islamic Revolution takes place. Now, and you see down here, the other problem with the Baghdad Pact is that, and this is during the Baghdad Pact, in 1953, a populist government came to the fore in Iran under Dr. Mossadegh, and he threatened the interests of the Seven Sisters, the seven largest oil corporations, by nationalizing. Okay, he threatened to nationalize the Iranian oil industry, and so the United States was pivotal in a quasi-coup. They actually ended up impeaching Mossadegh. He ultimately will be killed, but he's forced from power, and the United States will install the Pahlavi dynasty. Okay, Reza Pahlavi I, who is the Shah's father. The Shah will fall in 1979, and it's actually kind of interesting. It's Norman Schwarzkopf's father who will set up an organization known as the Savak. And the Savak is the Shah's secret police. And they're one of the scarier secret police forces that ever existed. They really were kind of a shadow organization. But then the Pahlavi dynasty, as it says here, the Pahlavi dynasty itself will be overthrown with the Islamic Revolution in 1979. In Southern Asia, what we have is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which binds the United States to South Vietnam. Okay, and just with a little bit of background, the Japanese occupied French Indochina during the Second World War. When the Japanese withdrew, the French took control over Indochina again, almost immediately, really beginning in 1947. The French underwent an indigenous populist revolution in Vietnam, led by the Viet Minh. Okay, in 1954, the French will suffer a disastrous defeat at a place called Dien Bien Phu, where the French Foreign Legion will be defeated. It will be a rather ignominious withdrawal for them, and during the negotiations that push the French out of Indochina, they'll agree to the division of Vietnam into North and South. North Vietnam will never recognize the division and will commence the war immediately, and this is when the Viet Minh will become the Viet Cong in 1954. And we'll study that at greater length a little bit under the Eisenhower administration in the 50s and then again in the 1960s when we talk about that. But at any rate, the U.S. inherits the French position in South Vietnam, forms the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and institutes what's known as the MACV, which we'll talk about again later in later lectures, which is the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and they'll be the U.S. force that engages both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army throughout the Vietnam conflict. And so the Vietnam conflict really begins for the United States in 1954, although really the Eisenhower administration never gets terribly directly involved with it. They'll send advisors and special forces to Vietnam, but they won't have the kind of escalation that we'll see later in the 1960s under the Johnson administration. And then, of course, we have the formation of ANZUS, and ANZUS will actually be active in the Vietnam conflict as well. They'll be, because they're sister organizations, they'll be involved with the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization as well. In Northern Asia, you have two alliance systems that serve as kind of the Bishop's Fork pillar for the United States in Northern Asia. The first of them is the Japanese-U.S. bilateral alliance, which will last throughout the Cold War, as will the United States and the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea, oh, there's a misspelling there, but the Republic of Korea is South Korea. Okay? And this, interestingly enough, will be the second test of this containment regime. We'll see the first test in just a minute here. Now, what this creates, now we look at this. We're back to this map that I showed you before. Here's our alliance system. We have NATO, the Baghdad Pact, and then later CENTO, which you see includes Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. Then we have the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, okay, ANZUS, and the Japanese and the Republic of Korea. Well, you've got a couple of problems. The first real reversal for the United States in their containment policy is the collapse of the Republic of China. The Republican government in China is forced onto the island of Taiwan, and you'll see here, I didn't really include it, but there's a U.S.-Taiwanese alliance as well. But this will give the Soviets an ally in the People's Republic of China. That alliance will last until 1955 between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And because of the collapse of Republican China, it creates a major gap in the containment fence right here in South Asia, okay, most pivotally with India. Okay, and so the United States will court India throughout the Cold War to try to close this gap and seal off the spread of Soviet and Chinese influence further. It will never be successful. Now, as a result of this courtship, the United States is going to do something that in later years will become rather dangerous. The main opponent of India, and one of the reasons that they never do align with the United States, the Indians will be actually one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement, is because of Indian opposition to Pakistan. Okay, and it's a little beyond our scope to discuss Pakistani-Indian relations. Actually, in my geography class, we talk a bit about it. But in an effort to gain a definitive advantage over Pakistan, India will begin the development in the early 1970s of nuclear weapons. This is in violation of both the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States, because they're interested in developing friendly relations with India, will look the other way as the Indians do this. And by the mid-70s, the Indians will have nuclear weapons. Okay, the Pakistanis will develop nuclear weapons in the 1990s. Okay, for very similar reasons. For very similar reasons, because by the mid-90s, okay, particularly after 96, in 1996, the Taliban take over in Afghanistan. It becomes apparent fairly early on to the Clinton administration and then later on with the Bush administration that there's a collision course happening between the United States and the Taliban in terms of U.S. interests in the Middle East, particularly in Southwest Asia. Okay, and so it's pretty clear that problems are going to be caused here. And so, in an interest of maintaining friendly relations with Pakistan, the United States will kind of look the other way as Pakistan develops a nuclear weapon. Okay, and so you have this major hole here. Now, it's never going to be exploited by the Soviets. It's one of the things about the containment thing. Well, we'll get to it when we discuss deterrence during the Eisenhower administration. But there's a fundamental kind of problem with deterrence theory itself that we'll get to at that time. We'll hold off till then. In addition, we have the formation of the United Nations. Okay, it was discussed at Yalta. It was discussed again at Potsdam. It will include the Soviet Union. It will include. Now we see what the United Nations is for. You can actually go to the UN site if you just Google the United Nations. You'll bump into UN.org, which is the United Nations website, and you can look all the stuff up you want to. If you've interest in foreign policy or international organizations, I encourage you to do it. We do it at length. We studied the United Nations at great length in my international relations class. We study it to some degree in American foreign policy as well. But the United Nations is specifically designed to do two things. One, to preserve the sovereignty of its members, and two, to come up with solutions other than war to settle conflicts between countries. Okay, so the prevention of war and the protection of the sovereignty of its members are the two main stated purposes in the UN Charter. To do this, they establish a number of organizations. Okay, there are a number of subdivision organizations. The largest of them is the General Assembly, which includes all members of the United Nations. There's UNESCO, which is the United Nations Economics and Social Council. There's a whole host of them. Okay, the most significant of them is, of course, the Security Council. The Security Council is the only organization in the United Nations capable of passing binding resolutions against its members. Okay, and again, this involves us in a rather lengthy discussion of the United Nations and when the United Nations is effective. One of the questions I ask my international relations students in one of the exams I give them is whether or not the United Nations is an effective organization. Under what conditions is it effective? Ultimately, what it boils down to is it's effective if the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can agree. Okay, because you see, there are 5 permanent members on the Security Council. You see the original members. The original 5 members that were permanent members were the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the Republic of China. Now, after 1971, in a rather controversial role, the Republic of China will be replaced by the People's Republic of China on the Security Council. Okay, this was actually okayed by the United States because it was the beginning, the very early stages of détente, and so they didn't want to make. This was the Nixon administration didn't want to make any waves with the Soviets, so they let that go. And as a result, all 5 of the permanent members have a veto power in the Security Council, meaning that if they vote against something, it gets defeated. And actually, the Security Council member that's used its veto the most is the United States. The United States has used its veto exclusively to veto Security Council resolutions against the State of Israel. The United States has exercised its veto by greater than a 2-to-1 margin over any other of the permanent members of the Security Council. All of them exclusively to defend the State of Israel. Now, okay, so unless these 5 can agree, the United Nations isn't going to be able to pass any kind of a binding resolution. They agree more often than you might think. The first significant one is going to be the decision to use military force to repel the North Korean invasion of South Korea. We'll get to why they're able to do that when we get to the Korean conflict in just a minute. Okay. We also had, and we'll recall our discussion from the previous lecture, 2.6 on the Bretton Woods system. We look now for economic stabilization. Part of the Truman containment policy was that the best way of preventing the spread of Soviet influence is to maintain a stable economic order and to integrate the economies of all of the various U.S. allies. Okay? And so the Bretton Woods system, and we discussed this in 2.6, the Bretton Woods system will be introduced to accomplish this, and it will introduce what's called there the liberal international economic order. Okay, the idea being that you create this global economy with integrated economies, and you isolate the Soviet Union. So we have kind of politically, we have this cordon sanitaire alliance system formed against the Soviets. And we also have an antecedent to that economically with the formation of the Bretton Woods Agreement, ultimately the formation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. All of this will exclude the Soviet Union. Okay? And it will exclude also, it should be noted, the People's Republic of China until the 1990s when they join in. When they join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and ultimately sign into the World Trade Organization. Now, in addition to this, we have the Marshall and the Dodge plans. The Marshall and Dodge plans, and we'll deal with this a little bit more extensively when we talk about Truman's domestic policy, because it's as much influenced by domestic concerns for the Truman administration and economic concerns domestically in the United States as it is by foreign policy and containment of the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan is a grant program by the United States, funded by the United States government, to rebuild the economies of Western Europe, which had been devastated during the Second World War. Again, what you want to accomplish is stable economies. More than that, what you need to accomplish, okay, an export-driven economy. Okay, if you are going to have exportation as an integral part of your economic welfare, such as the United States does, requires that you have trading partners. To have trading partners, they have to have a stable economy. If they don't have money, they can't buy our stuff, is basically what it gets down to. So we need a way for the Europeans to gain money. And so we need to rebuild their economies. The Dodge Plan will be the antecedent to this, okay, will be the equivalent of this for the Japanese, okay? This is going to ultimately kind of come back to haunt the United States because it will end up that Germany and Japan will be two of the largest world economic powers, okay? And later on, even still, the European Union, which I always think is kind of interesting because it was the Germans and the Japanese that were the main Axis powers in the Second World War. They were defeated, and then by the 1990s, they came to be two of the largest global economic players, which always strikes me as kind of ironically amusing. Okay, we're now going to discuss the early challenges to the containment regime, and we'll look at them in turn. The first of them is the Berlin crisis. Now, if you look at a map, and I didn't put one in here, but if you look at a map, Berlin is entirely within East Germany. Remember, under the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, the United States and the Soviet Union agree to divide both Europe, with Eastern Europe becoming the Soviet bloc and Western Europe becoming effectively the American bloc, the NATO organization. And Germany itself would be divided into essentially 3 zones. It was originally 3 zones, okay, between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And then the British and the United States would carve out a zone for the French in West Germany. East Germany becomes a Soviet bloc. Berlin, which is also divided into these zones, is entirely within East Germany. And you remember us discussing, this was the difficult negotiations at Potsdam, and I made mention of this, that Stalin very reluctantly agrees to the division of Berlin. Because it makes no sense. Okay, Berlin is entirely within East Germany, therefore it should be East German. Okay, and as I mentioned, this is one of the discussions that we had in terms of why the United States dropped the atomic bomb, used nuclear weapons at the end of World War II, was to send a signal to the Soviets because of the difficulty in these negotiations. Stalin ultimately reluctantly agrees to the division of Berlin, but will then very early on challenge that division. Okay, East German forces with Soviet assistance will blockade Berlin. Okay, to force the West, mostly the United States and Britain, out of West Berlin, and therefore make Berlin de facto an entirely East German city. Okay, and you see some things here. I have a website down here where you can find all the information on this. It's really, it's truly, it's worth reading. It's worth looking at because it is truly one of the most remarkable logistical feats in the history of the human species. It is absolutely incredible what the United States and Britain were able to do to support the western division, the western part of Berlin. And you see here, we'll just go through some of it. A total of 277,000 flights are flown by 689 military and civilian aircraft. This is from June of 1948 until the next spring. They deliver 349,509 tons, that's metric tons, of food, coal, and supplies between June of 48 and June of 49. So that's within a year. At the height of the airlift, an aircraft carrying supplies landed in Berlin every minute. Okay? Because of this, the Soviet blockade was unsuccessful. They couldn't prevent this. Okay? They didn't want to militarize the conflict by trying to shoot these airplanes down. That would militarize the conflict and lead to a military confrontation with the West. And at the time, the Soviets were at a disadvantage, principally because of a tremendous lopsided advantage for the United States in strategic forces, meaning nuclear forces. Okay? And so ultimately the Soviets will surrender their attempt in June of 49, and that'll be the last we hear of it. In Asia, we have a number of challenges, some of which I already made kind of passing mention of. The first of them is the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The second of them will be the Korean conflict, which we'll cover in some detail. The third of them is the collapse of the French position in Indochina. This is as a result of the insurgency launched in 47 by the Viet Minh. And I make mention here of the Viet Minh leaders who will later become pivotal in the Vietnam conflict against the United States. Ho Chi Minh, of course, very famous. The one who's not heard of very much is Vo Dong Giap. Vo Dong Giap died 2 years ago at the tender age of 102. And in point of fact, I make mention of him here because Giap, General Giap, is one of the truly great captains of history. He was militarily, he was unbelievably good. He is the one, what he developed early on, used it against the French to some degree, but he really developed it when the United States became involved. He developed the strategy of insurgency against the United States. He developed a strategy that could defeat the United States. He referred to it as the Long War Strategy. It was based on the premise that the United States is very sensitive to casualties. Okay? So if you are just willing to endure the punishment that the U.S. military can unleash on you, and it is considerable, okay? If you can just endure that, eventually the United States will tire of the conflict and leave. The final U.S. forces will leave Vietnam in 1973. That's 19 years of fighting the United States. Particularly, it will become severe in the mid-1960s. The United States lost approximately 55,000 men killed in action in Vietnam. The Vietnamese do not know how many they lost. Okay, they didn't keep accurate counts. Estimates range wildly from anywhere from 250,000 men to over 1 million men. Okay, but they weren't going to give up. They just had to be willing to suffer that kind of damage. Okay, and we'll discuss this at greater length when we get into the 1960s. I'll make mention of just a couple of things right now. In 1965, the Johnson administration, as part of their escalation, will undertake Operation Rolling Thunder, which will be the bombing of Hanoi, the bombing of North Vietnam, in an attempt to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was bringing supplies to the Viet Cong, and to inflict damage on unacceptable losses on the city of Hanoi. And in 1 year of Operation Rolling Thunder, more ordnance, meaning more bombs, will fall on North Vietnam than are used on Nazi Germany in the entirety of World War II. And so it's considerable what the United States unleashes. They will defeat the French, you see here, at Dien Bien Phu. This will become important to us. When we begin to discuss U.S. involvement in the Vietnamese conflict, we'll talk about Dien Bien Phu in a different context. And then we have, as I mentioned earlier, the establishment of the MACV, which is the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, in 1954. Now, on with the Korean conflict. Okay? The Korean conflict breaks out in June of 1950. The United States and the Republic of Korea are tremendously unprepared for the conflict. Okay, the North Koreans had actually warned that it was going to be the case. See, neither North Korea or South Korea really accepted the division of Korea. The Republic of Korea a little bit more so under the influence of the United States, but North Korea never accepts it. They will use this opportunity to challenge the United States. Okay, now their calculation is that the United States forces in South Vietnam are ill prepared to defend South Korea against a full-scale North Korean attack. And in point of fact, they're correct. Okay, and this is phase one. Phase one, they drive the United States and the Republic of Korea back to a small little area around Pusan Harbor, which is in the very southeastern corner of South Korea. They take the capital of Seoul about 3 days into the conflict. Okay, now the North Koreans are hoping that either the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union, or both of them, will intervene when the United States finally gears itself up. The United States will go to the United Nations Security Council. Now, the reason they go to the Security Council is they're going to take advantage of what, there's disagreement on this, but I think it's a Soviet error. Okay? The Soviet Union boycotts the United Nations. They boycott the United Nations because when the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are established, it is decided that the Republic of China, which is on the island of Taiwan, will be given the Chinese permanent seat on the Security Council and therefore the veto power. Okay? The Soviets feel that it should be the People's Republic of China, which is mainland China. Okay? Because of this objection, at the time of the Korean conflict, the Soviet Union will be boycotting the United Nations. And so their member in the Security Council will not be present at the vote. And so when the United States goes to the Security Council to condemn the North Korean attack on South Korea and to call for sanctions and for the Security Council to sanction the use of military force against North Korea to repel the invasion, the Soviet Union isn't there to veto the resolution. Okay? And so we have complicity on the part of the United Nations. So the United Nations goes along with it. And so when we discuss the operation by the United States in Korea, it's really a UN operation. The United States is the lead force, and they will be in overall command under Douglas MacArthur for most of the conflict. But it's really a United Nations force. Now in phase 2, okay, so now here we have a map. Okay, now in phase 1, the North Koreans come across, this is the border, the 38th parallel. The North Koreans come along and in a sweeping wheel-like motion will drive the United States to a small area around Pusan Harbor right here. Okay? And then we will witness, and the reason that I make mention of this and I kind of highlight this is because for those of us who have interest in military history, one of the truly most phenomenal operations in modern history, certainly post-World War II, is Douglas MacArthur's design and implementation and execution of the counterattack. Okay? The plan is to take U.S. forces that are stationed in Japan and the U.S. forces in Pusan Harbor and launch an amphibious assault at Incheon Harbor, just to the west of Seoul. The idea being that if you can do this, you can then cut across Korea with very little resistance. The North Korean army is down here. Okay, they've pinned the South Korean army in the United States at Pusan Harbor. So the North Korean army is all down here. If we can successfully launch an amphibious assault, we can cut across the peninsula and cut off the North Korean army. The North Korean army will die on the vine. Okay? Brilliant idea. But it should be noted that MacArthur, it's a brilliant idea, but it's really kind of a harebrained scheme. Okay? The tides at Incheon Harbor in the summer are some of the highest tides in the area. They're the highest tides in the Yellow Sea. You generally have tides of 35 to 40 feet. You're talking waves of 35 to 40 feet. Okay? You can't launch an amphibious landing like that. Okay? What will happen is the amphibious landing craft will be swallowed up by these 40-foot swells, and all of your troops will die. MacArthur gets lucky. Okay? For reasons that are really unclear, during the invasion, the tides are low. The tides are unexpectedly small. The seas are unexpectedly calm. They meet very little North Korean resistance. That was another of the fears, was that the North Koreans would get intelligence and would get intel on the amphibious landing and would redeploy their army up towards Seoul and would cut the American forces to ribbons as they landed at Incheon Harbor. This, in fact, didn't happen. North Korean resistance was, in fact, remarkably light, lighter than MacArthur had expected. And so it's a remarkably successful operation. It's truly what they call textbook. It's a textbook amphibious operation. And the United States will very rapidly cut across the peninsula and cut off the vast majority of the North Korean army. The North Korean army will be forced, what remains of most of the North Korean army will surrender. What remains of the North Korean army will run back north beyond the 38th parallel. MacArthur will then take this opportunity to cross the 38th parallel. Okay? Now, this is a real gray area, and it's really something that's for international lawyers more than anything else. The sanctioning of the use of force by the United Nations Security Council specifically sanctioned the use of force to repel the North Korean invasion of South Korea. It did not sanction the counter-invasion of North Korea and toppling the North Korean government. What MacArthur decides and what Truman decides as part of the containment regime is this could be an opportunity to repeal the division of the Korean Peninsula, launch an invasion, and in fact unify the Korean Peninsula. Okay? That's going to create phase 3 of the operation. Okay? The United States will cross the 38th parallel rapidly, in fact too rapidly, move north, crushing North Korean resistance in an earnest campaign to reunify the North Korean Peninsula. Now, what MacArthur is going to do is he's going to launch a pincer attack, and he's going to launch one corps of his military up the west coast of the peninsula, the other up the east coast, leaving an enormous, gigantic gap between the two of them. Okay? And this is because MacArthur does not believe that the People's Republic of China will intervene. Now, at this point in time, the People's Republic of China and the United States do not have formal diplomatic relations. The Chinese send a signal through the Indian ambassador. They tell, in other words, when two people aren't speaking, we tell them that, you get this he said, she said, right? Tell them that I said this. The Chinese indicate through the Indian ambassador that the crossing of the 38th parallel is viewed by the People's Republic as an aggressive act by the United States. And the People's Republic of China is concerned that MacArthur, with the same zeal with which he moved north of the 38th parallel, will, with the same zeal, move across the Yalu River and invade Manchuria, trying to topple the People's Republic. There's some indication that MacArthur did have that in mind. Okay, it's ultimately gonna lead to a dispute between Truman and MacArthur. Okay, when MacArthur moves the United Nations forces, the U.S. forces, north beyond the 38th parallel and moves towards the Chinese border at the Yalu River, he advocates bombing all of the bridges across the Yalu River. The Truman administration doesn't want to do this. The reason you don't want to do this is because of a territorial dispute. The Yalu River itself, which serves as the border between North Korea and the People's Republic of China, is divided evenly. Half the river is Chinese, the northern half of the river is Chinese, the southern half is North Korean. If you bomb the bridges, you are bombing Chinese territory. The northern part of those bridges is Chinese territory. If you bomb Chinese territory, you give them casus belli. You give them an excuse for becoming involved in the conflict. Okay? And beating the living daylights out of North Korea is one thing. A full-scale war with the People's Republic of China, with close to 1 billion people at that time, that's another problem altogether. Okay, that will lead MacArthur and Truman into a kind of a conflict that becomes progressively tense, and ultimately will lead to MacArthur's dismissal, because MacArthur will become very public and very vocal about his opposition and what he thinks of Truman and what he thinks of Truman's decision not to try to prevent Chinese intervention. The Chinese, for their part, will move approximately 300,000 troops to the Yalu River. And in an absolutely masterful operation. How this took place is just absolutely unbelievable. They literally will take MacArthur by surprise. They will cross on Christmas in November. They will cross in November of 1950. Okay, within 72 hours, they will cross 300,000 troops across the Yalu River, and they'll take MacArthur by surprise. MacArthur doesn't see them crossing the Yalu River until they're already across. How in the hell do you sneak 300,000 troops across a river? But at any rate, they will cross the river. They will rapidly reverse MacArthur's gains. They will drive a wedge between the tremendously overextended. MacArthur, because he's extended all the way to the Chinese border, has developed an enormous gap in his two main corps, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. He is having progressive difficulties trying to logistically support the northern tier of those operations, and the Chinese will exploit this in full measure. Okay, they'll come very close to cutting off the U.S. forces. Okay, in a kind of a pincer movement. The U.S. will be forced into a retreat, a rapid withdrawal. Okay, back to the 38th parallel, and at that point, the Chinese will recross the 38th parallel, recapture Seoul, push the U.S. forces back, and then a general stalemate will ensue. And this is all in the winter of 1950-51. From that point forward, for the next 2 years, you're going to see a stalemate. Okay, and that's the time period for the most part. For those of you who are fans of the show MASH, I was never a great big giant fan of the show MASH. It was all right. The movie was really good. The show was okay. But this is the main time period of MASH. Okay, is during that stalemate where you have very little progress being made by either side. This ultimately leads to a negotiated peace. We'll discuss it a little bit more when we get to Eisenhower. MacArthur will be relieved in April of 1951. This is because of his opposition to Truman and Truman's decision not to bomb the bridges on the Yalu River or try to prevent the People's Republic of China from intervening. In July of 51, as this stalemate ensues in July of 51, they will begin peace negotiations. During the stalemate, you see here between 51 and 53, there will be 140,000 casualties on both sides. And so it becomes really a bloody affair. It's not as bloody an affair in the early stages, in Phase 1 and Phase 2, because it's more of a war of maneuver and speed. But by Phase 3, when it degenerates into a stalemate, it becomes just a massive slugfest between the People's Republic of China and the United States. And the problem, of course, is the People's Republic of China, just in terms of numbers, is much larger than the United States. And if you look at it geographically, the United States has to project force and support this operation 5,000 miles away. Now, they have local forces both in the Republic of Korea and in Japan, but the Chinese can just keep pouring troops across the Yalu River. And so the U.S. is kind of at a disadvantage. As a result of the degeneration into stalemate, and as a result largely of MacArthur's ongoing campaign against Truman politically, the Democratic Party takes the blame for the failure of the United States to win a decisive victory. Okay, what MacArthur keeps hitting on is, well, if Truman had done what I told him to do and bombed the bridges on the Yalu River, the Chinese wouldn't have been able to come across. We wouldn't be in this situation. We would have decisively defeated the North Korean army, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and this is one of these what ifs. What if the United States had actually bombed the bridges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At any rate, when it gets right down to it, there's a saying that was made very famous during the Kennedy administration that success has many fathers, failure is a lonely orphan. However you slice it, the U.S. operation in invading North Korea was a failure. It didn't achieve its objective. And when all is said and done, Harry Truman coined the term himself. In fact, he coins the term just before he leaves office, that the buck stops here. Okay? The President of the United States is the captain of the ship. He is commander of U.S. military forces. He is commander-in-chief. Okay? If an objective is failed to be achieved, the president is to blame. Period. You don't blame your underlings. Okay? You blame only the president has to shoulder the responsibility himself. And so Truman will do that. To his credit, Truman will take the responsibility for the failure to achieve a decisive victory in Korea. And on 27 July 1953, an armistice will be agreed to that effectively reestablishes casus or antebellum conditions at the 38th parallel, being the border. The division of the Koreas is recognized, and it's a division that continues to this day. Okay. Now, on to the domestic side of history during the post-war era. Truman is faced with a dilemma after World War II, and it's very similar to the dilemma that faced the United States after World War I. And it's simple enough to explain. Okay, you ratchet up production to meet wartime demand. Okay, the U.S. is supplying the Allies, the U.S. is supplying itself, etc., etc. So you ratchet up production. Okay, I think we saw in that one PowerPoint they invested a grand total of about $35 billion in increasing their productivity. This is to say the United States. You put everybody back to work. Okay, those who aren't in the field fighting are at work supporting those who are in the field fighting. Okay, great. So everything's going. This ultimately was the answer. We talked about the new at great length. We talked about the New Deal and the fact that, well, really by the onset of the Second World War, the second New Deal that Roosevelt had initiated was really petering out. It was fizzling. and wartime. By the time of the Japanese attack, production levels were still below what they were in 1929, so it wasn't working very well. Well, in World War II, with all the increase in production and all the increase in employment, production levels skyrocket. Okay, they go through the roof. Okay, that's all well and good. But now the war's over. Okay, there's not going to be the kind of demand that there was during the war, so productivity is going to drop. Now, in addition to that, which means, first of all, they're not going to need as many laborers, and so people are going to get laid off. In addition to that, you got servicemen coming back, all of whom are going to need jobs. So the question is, how do you prevent this from going into a recession? Okay? Well, for Truman, he's going to launch something called the Fair Deal. Here's the problem. Truman is going to get into a battle, a political battle with the Federal Reserve. Okay? The Fed favors, at this time, this is now 1946, 47, the Fed favors a stricter monetary policy, reduce the supply of money. Why? Well, for reasons that we just talked about. As production during the war increased, the supply of money had to increase to match it. Okay? You had to increase the supply of money still more to pay for the war itself. Okay? Not a problem. Not a problem because Truman had the Office of Price Administration that kept control on prices, that kept prices from rising. Okay? Well, now the war's over. You have, which means you're going to have a reduction in productivity, and you still have this enormous supply of money. So you're going to end up with a massive monetary overhang. The only way to correct for that is over time, rein in the supply of money. That will bring the supply of money down to match production levels, and you'll avoid inflation. Truman didn't like that idea. Truman didn't like that idea because what that means is you run a very serious effect, a very serious danger of running into a recession. Okay? And you see what it says there is that Truman opposes because of its contractionary effect on the U.S. economy. When you reduce the supply of money, you run the risk of contracting the economy. The economy is already going to contract because of the reduction in productivity after the war. Okay? So Truman is going to do something. Truman's going to launch this Fair Deal. Here's the Fair Deal. Okay? This is from a theoretical point of view. Okay? We talked during Roosevelt about the application of John Maynard Keynes's theory. Okay? And the New Deal was the first real application of this theory. Now, the problem is that Keynes envisioned his model to be used to correct for a recession. In other words, when the economy goes into a recession, what Keynes suggests is cut taxes. That increases people's disposable income and will increase their spending. That will drive demand up. Simultaneously, increase government spending. That drives demand up. That drive up of demand will correct for the recession. Okay? This was Keynes's idea in a nutshell. Keynes didn't envision his model being used to attempt to avoid a recession. And it's still a debate in theoretical economics. Like Alan Greenspan, for example, who was head of the Fed during the 90s until 2004, he believed that it was possible, actually till 2008, he believed that it was possible to avoid a recession altogether, that the economy never need to sink now into a recession. Now, classic economic theory, okay, macroeconomic theory suggests, no, a recession is a natural part of the business cycle. Economies go through this business cycle where there's growth, they reach their highest potential at the peak, then it drops off in a recession, goes down through a trough, corrects itself, and comes back up. If you remember, Keynes was saying, well, there's no self-correcting mechanism. There's no guarantee that once it hits the trough, it's going to go back up. Okay, that was the big debate, and it's still a big debate. Okay, well, what Truman's going to try to do is use Keynesian economics, this increase in government spending and this reduction in taxes, to prevent the recession from happening in the first place. Okay, and we want to see how he does with it. All right. Okay. a series of programs are launched, okay, some of which are quite famous. The first of them is the Office of Price Administration. Now, this was during the war. It was Roosevelt that put this in. It was used to control wages and prices during the war so that you wouldn't have wartime inflation. Well, now the war's over. Truman is running the risk of wartime inflation for reasons that we just talked about. The Fed's concerned that the supply of money creates a monetary overhang because it's greater than the supply of goods and services, and so you have inflationary pressure. What Truman's going to do to correct for this is maintain the Office of Price Administration. By government regulation, don't let prices rise. Okay, Nixon's going to do this. Nixon's going to do this in the early 70s. Okay, he's going to put on a wage price freeze. Okay, and what Truman's going to do is gradually, over a period of time, raise the price control, ultimately lifting it all together and letting the market equilibrium determine the price. Okay, and so he's going to maintain it until October of 46, which is a year and 3 months after the war's over. Still in all, even though he's done this, okay, and he as an indication that he may have been right about his fears of the economy sinking into recession, by January of 46, unemployment in the United States had hit 1.3 million people, which was the largest since the Great Depression. In terms of the dealing with labor, we first have the Employment Act of 1946, which, among other things, has the establishment of the Council of Economic Advisors, which still exists today. It's Truman that instituted that, and they're economic advisors to the president. At the time of Roosevelt, when Keynes kind of gave Roosevelt some advice, that there was no such council. Okay, now there is. The big one, which is still in effect, is the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. The Taft-Hartley Act allows the president to intervene in the case of a labor strike and seize control of productive facilities. Okay, it in fact allows the executive branch in general and their agencies to do so. Okay, it will end closed shops for unions. In other words, you can't force someone to join a union. And so it also will limit unions' ability to strike. So it's kind of, the Taft-Hartley is a reversal for labor in general. Okay, it takes away a lot of their leverage in terms of striking and what they can do. Probably the most famous of the fair deal programs is what becomes known as the GI Bill. This is the Servicemen Readjustment Act. It's passed in 1944. Okay, so it's actually passed during Roosevelt, but Truman extends it. All right, low interest loans for veterans, college grants for veterans, low interest mortgages for veterans. Now the idea is that you have a large military population as veterans coming back from the Second World War. Okay, we want these people, okay, the veterans, to be included in the economy. They're going to be one of the primary driving forces that's going to prevent a recession and maintain economic growth. Okay, so all in all, that's the basic idea. Now we're going to see this because Eisenhower is going to continue this plan, and so is Johnson. Nixon will as well, but he'll be a little bit more reserved on it, as will Eisenhower. Okay, so from Truman onwards, what we are going to see in U.S. history is a recurring theme, a trend of presidents attempting to use Keynesian economics to prevent a recession. Okay, and it's only recently that we're starting to see the long-term effects of doing that. Okay, because eventually the piper has to be paid. Eventually a recession is unavoidable. And now, obviously, this is a debatable point in economics. Okay, economists disagree on this. But the traditional idea is that ultimately a recession has to take place. The economy cannot continually grow. It will overheat. Okay, we'll deal with that more later. Or in macroeconomics if we do macroeconomics. On to the political situation, Truman is not in good shape. Okay, particularly after 1950. Now, after World War II, he's associated with Roosevelt, with Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president during the mainstay of the U.S. efforts during the Second World War. And so he rides those coattails a little bit. Okay, he was also in the seat, so to speak. He was in the command chair at the time of the American victory against the Japanese and the Germans, and so he gets a certain amount of political collateral for that. That political collateral is going to go away in Korea. Okay, the United States does not achieve a decisive military victory against the North Koreans and the Chinese. Ultimately, Truman is commander-in-chief of U.S. Armed Forces, and so he's the captain. When the ship falters, you blame the captain. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter how. I used to explain this. I was explaining this to a friend of mine. Okay, at some of the restaurants that I worked at, I was the head cook. I was like head chef. Okay, the problem with being head chef is that anything that happens in that kitchen is on me. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if someone else screws up an order. It doesn't matter. It makes no difference. It's on me. That's what it is to be the head of something. Okay? That's what it is to be president. And so Truman's going to be held accountable. More than that, Douglas MacArthur was commander of U.S. forces in Korea. Well, he was also commander of U.S. forces, Allied forces in the Pacific against the Japanese. So he's the hero of World War II. Okay? Public opinion is that MacArthur's the one that defeated the Japanese. Well, when he has his big falling out with Truman, people generally side with MacArthur. So whatever political collateral Truman had from being associated with Franklin Roosevelt, he expends immediately in Korea. Okay? So that really by 48, prior to Korea, he barely wins the election. And by 52, he's dead in the water politically. In addition to this, okay, as we've seen before, and it's really interesting to do both U.S. History 1 and U.S. History 2 here, because what we see as a recurring theme through American history is we see a political party crystallize and then mobilize support for itself, gain a majority, come into power, okay, and then we see that party split. We saw it with the Federalists, okay, back in U.S. History 1, way back in the 1790s. We saw a split take place in the party originally between Hamilton and Madison, and then Adams joined Madison. Okay, so the party split. What came of this? The Republican Party under Thomas Jefferson rose up. Well, what did we see by 1818, 1819? Okay, we saw that party split between the more limited national government states' rights Republicans and the strong national government Republicans. Okay, what came of that? Well, ultimately, the rise of the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. Well, then what did we see? We saw that party split. Recurring through American history, we see this constant thing. We saw it already in our course in U.S. History 2. We saw it when we had Theodore Roosevelt in charge of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party had not completely dominated, but had held sway through the late 19th century in the aftermath of the Civil War. Well, what's going to happen with Theodore Roosevelt is he's launches a whole series of progressive policies, and the conservative wing of the Republican Party splits, and so there's this division in the party. Okay, well, the same thing's going to happen now. Opposition to Truman has risen up within the party. Okay, so you're going to have a rebirth of this progressive movement. Okay, they're in favor of the fair deal. They think the fair deal should go further. But then you're going to have Strom Thurmond, okay, who becomes one of the longest-standing senators in U.S. history. Probably, I think, actually the longest, with the possible exception of Byrd and Rockefeller. Okay, Thurmond rises up with the Dixiecrats, okay, the Democrats from the South, who really, ideologically, are more like Republican, okay? So you're going to have the Democratic Party split into this very progressive wing and this more conservative wing, okay? Well, the Republicans, for their part, They're still living under the specter of Hoover, who was in charge when the economy broke into the Great Depression. And in the 48 election, they really don't have a candidate. Okay, MacArthur isn't retired. MacArthur really, for all of his being the victor of the war against the Japanese, he's really not a particularly charismatic person. And so, but in the 48 election, the Republicans really don't have anyone to stand as an attractive candidate against Truman. And so Truman squeaks by over Dewey in a tight election. Okay, well, by 52, that's not going to be the case. There's two things that are going to prevent Truman. One is in 48, they took advantage of the fact that the Republicans really couldn't field a candidate. Well, in 52, the Republicans present Dwight David Eisenhower as their candidate. Well, Dwight David Eisenhower is the mastermind of the D-Day invasion in the perception of Americans. In point of fact, the D-Day invasion was a cooperative effort in planning between the Allied powers, most notably the British and the Americans. But Eisenhower is given credit for it. Eisenhower is given credit for the defeat of Nazism. Okay, so he's wildly popular. Truman has just gone through this controversy over Korea. The United States is embroiled in the Korean conflict in 1952, if you recall. The peace won't come until the following year in 53. And so Truman is being held accountable. Okay, he's being scapegoated for the lackluster performance of American forces in Korea. Here comes Eisenhower, the hero of World War II, and so Truman really doesn't have much of a chance. Now, in addition to that, the 22nd Amendment was passed, okay, in 1947. The 22nd Amendment limits presidents to 2 terms in office. This is to prevent another, monarchy from developing like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would probably still be elected president if he was alive. Okay, so Truman's dead in the water. And this is what's going to lead to the rise of Eisenhower. Now, in the midst of all this, we have the second Red Scare. Remember, we talked about the first Red Scare in the lecture on the 1920s, and we talked about, okay, we had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and the Bolsheviks fully come into power in 1919, and the fear is, particularly in the wake of progressivism in the United States, that the United States could teeter on the edge of their own quasi-communist revolution. Okay? And so you had this swing to conservatism that lost the progressives their majority and led to these Republican presidencies and a Republican-dominated Congress, etc., etc. We talked all about that in the 1920s. Okay? Well, now, once again, we're going to have that. Because emerging from World War II, as we've talked about many times, we have the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay? Well, the fear is, and in all honesty, the American government at the time is responsible for a lot of this. Because the Truman Doctrine has come in. In 47, Truman needs to gather popular public support for his policy of containment, and particularly for that NSC 68, which we talked about, which is the use of military force against the spread of communism, or against the spread of Soviet influence, if you prefer. Okay, so to do that, he has to make the threat of the Soviet Union a clear and present danger to the American people. And so by the end of the 1940s, there is a kind of a terror that strikes the United States about Soviet influence. And so you're going to have a movement of political repression very reminiscent of the 1920s. Okay? The most famous of this is going to become the McCarthy trials. Okay? So we have the rise of McCarthyism. The House of Representatives forms a subcommittee called the House Committee on American Activities. Okay? It will be headed by Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Senator Joseph McCarthy will go on a witch hunt. Okay? At one point he says he knows that there are 254 card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the United States government. Okay, he'll go on a witch hunt. He'll be given considerable latitude, okay, on this witch hunt. He'll denunciate communism, but really McCarthyism is the Red Scare, okay? He'll censor Hollywood. He'll put people on trial for being members of the Communist Party. Everyone to McCarthy is a subversive. And so it becomes very reminiscent of the 1920s, only to a much more amplified degree. By 1954, under the Eisenhower administration, McCarthy really has played himself out. People are kind of tired of the whole Red Scare. Okay? There is still this concern for Soviet influence. There is still a concern about communism. But the general public opinion is that McCarthy has gone too far. Okay? That you're really bordering on a repressive kind of tyrannical regime. And so McCarthy will be censored by the Senate, and that forces him from power. That's December of 1954. He'll be censored for conduct on becoming a senator. He'll be removed from the House Committee on Un-American Activity, and that'll be the end of it. There will be also during this time the passage of the Internal Security Act of 1950, and again, it's a recurring theme, this Red Scare, okay? It requires communist organizations to register with the Attorney General's office. We have the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952, which limits immigration to the U.S., and it limits immigration to the U.S. on country of origin, countries that are Eastern European, countries that are more given to sympathies towards the Soviet Union aren't permitted in. Okay? Now, in addition to all this, we also have a couple of very famous subversive trials. Albert Hiss is put on trial for being sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and the most famous of them all is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Okay, the Rosenberg trial really begins in 51 and ends in 53. The Rosenbergs were indicted and convicted, and they were guilty as sin of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. Okay, they sold the secrets to the Soviets that got the Soviets the atomic bomb. Okay, and they will be executed in 1953 for having done so. They will be the first Americans tried and executed for treason during a time of peace. And I think that concludes the lecture on the post-war era.